This afternoon. I want to welcome you and thank you for joining today. This is a very special program. The Civic Association has offered our members the benefit of hearing from dynamic speakers. Many of them are you, members, directors, residents of Palm Beach, ambassadors, authors, and significant leaders. All have enriched us with their experience and insights. Today is a special one as we celebrate the launch of Michael Ainslie's book, Nose for Trouble. I have to tell you, this is you really should read this book because this guy is completely self-made. Everything he did, he had to do from scratch. And even when he had some really good things happen to him, he got hit with injury and other things like that, and he never let it get down. And I think it's just a tribute to what you can do from a very modest background and have to fight through a lot of things to be as successful as he was. I especially note that he was a member of the Posse Foundation, and he can talk about that in there, which I believe is it over 100 schools that participate in it? 60, and they've
9,000 kids.
They've given away $1.4 billion for tuition for kids that are selected to be leaders and take them to college, and they have all kinds of jobs that they've done over a period of time. He was the CEO of Sotheby's. He was on the board of Lehman. That's a great story, and he's got a lot of them. The things that he did over a period of time. I just think this is a great story from a wonderful person, and he continues to do all these things here and be as helpful as he can to us and the community here, the recreation area, things, so many things. So I want to say we're also very grateful to our supporters, our directors, our members, and our sponsors. Your dues and donations allow us to not only bring you programs like this, but also to produce weekly news. Do you know that the Palm Beach Civic Association is Palm Beach's only producer of live news, delivered to you in your inbox each week? Please be sure you're receiving This Week in Palm Beach. You do not want to miss what's happening in our community. And we've been very, 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 very blessed to have Tim Malloy, who's come over here from his career in newspapers and television, and he was with Channel 5 for a number of years. And we have a little agreement with them where they're going to cover here in any kind of a bad situation, because if they don't do that, they don't really cover. So hurricanes or things like that, they'll get special coverage. You're going to see it from wherever you are.
Tim, you were also Channel 12 at one time.
I worked for Mr. Dreyfus.
That's right.
He hired me.
A very good CBS station.
Thank you, Bob.
Owned by, God, I just think I'm also pleased to introduce today's sponsor. Scripps Research has been a longtime partner of the Civic Association and a supporter of our website and programs over the years. Please welcome Doug Bingham, our Civic Association Director and Vice President of Scripps Florida Operations. Doug?
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, fellow members, directors of the association, for hosting this. Scripps is pleased to sponsor today's talk by Michael Ainslie. Michael's fascinating career is a testament to the values of embracing tough challenges and thriving. That's what we do at Scripps Research. We embrace tough challenges, and the world is better for it. The scientists we recruit at Scripps Research are people who hear "that can't be done" and reply, "watch me." Today, the world is worried about a novel coronavirus apparently originating in China that appears to be highly contagious and have pandemic potential. So far, 5 people in the U.S. have been tested positive for this new virus, and the clock is ticking. This is the ultimate tough challenge, and we're on it. At Scripps, Teams of scientists both here and in California are racing to see if we can identify how this virus infects cells and then find a drug to prevent that infection. Our scientists at Scripps, Florida have done this before. Professors Michael Farzan and Hurry and Cho identified the cell surface receptor for the Sars virus. That was the virus. It's a coronavirus also, and it's the one that was so much problematic just before this virus. One of their staff scientists helped identify the receptor for the MERS virus. That's for the Middle East version of the coronavirus. They developed methods that the rest of the world has used to try to develop drugs. Once we know the receptor, we go further, though. Our scientists can take advantage of a resource that exists at Scripps and nowhere else. Our nonprofit drug discovery division, Caliber, together with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, has created an invaluable resource called the Reframe Chemical Library. It's not a library of books, but a library of drug-like compounds that have been already tested in phase 1 safety testing in humans and therefore can rapidly be deployed against dangerous diseases. Caliber has already shown that some of the compounds in the Reframe library halt replication of the SARS and the MERS viruses. Caliber scientists are working with Farzan and Cho to test whether or not they will work against the Wuhan virus, which is now problematic in China. These groups are also working on trying to discover brand new compounds that would supplement those Reframe technology compounds. That's a tough challenge, and there are many others at Scripps. Scripps was founded in California and grew into one of the largest biomedical research institutes in the world. 16 years ago, Jeb Bush came to us and said, "Would you like to move here?" And I said, "Too many bugs." But moving here wasn't in the cards, but expansion was. And so we built this campus in Florida, a place known as for sun and fun, and certainly qualifies as a tough challenge. And with your help, we have done it, building it into a thriving hub of innovation and science education that you see today. 16 years later, this community can boast a top 10 ranked graduate program, number 1 and number 2 research institutes in the world globally, and the institution ranked number 1 for influence and innovation as measured by patent citations and patents. It's right here in our community because we embraced the tough challenge. Some of you were there with us. Alex was there with us from the very beginning. Your support is important to our continued success. We invite you to join us at our new public lecture series, The Front Row. And you can go to our website, scripps.edu, Front Row, Florida, or go to the events page to RSVP, and one of our delightful staff will reach. Tara Holcomb's here, Tracy Kerwin's here, and Stacy Singer here. Will help you with finding a lecture that you might want to attend. So, would you guys stand up while you're here, aren't you? You gals, stand up. Thank you so much. So thank you all for all you do to make Palm Beach community one of the best places in the world to live. I've lived in this community now for 2 years full time. I love it. I can't tell you. My only complaint is, for all you've heard this before, is there's no Mexican food. We have to work on that. So we couldn't ask for a better home to tackle the world's toughest biomedical problems. With that, I will now turn it over to Mary, who's.
Thank you, Doug. And Doug, we are looking forward to bringing our members and our directors to Scripps later in the season and receiving a tour. There's so much to see at Scripps for all of us to enjoy, but most importantly, learn from. So thank you again for your wonderful sponsorship. Our guest speaker today needs little introduction. He was recruited by Stan Rumbo to join the Palm Beach Civic Association in 2003. He's a director, a member of our executive committee since 2008, and became our treasurer in 2019. Michael is our friend, he's our neighbor, and he's been a tireless advocate for the good of the cause in Palm Beach for 21 years. His middle initial of L should really stand for leadership. Michael Ainslie's life and his career as an entrepreneur, CEO, board member, consultant, and mentor to countless people is an incredible lesson in accepting challenges and achieving great success. Michael's devotion to projects and causes that create a better future for others is no more evident than through his leadership of the Posse Foundation, And as our chairman, Bob Wright, said, wow, what work he has done. $1.4 billion in scholarships to scholars, 9,200 scholars and alumni whose lives have been forever changed by the Posse Foundation, with Michael Ainslie serving as the founding chairman and now honorary chairman. Or closer to home, here in 33480, as vice chairman, as the Friends of Recreation, overcoming obstacles and succeeding in being a catalyst for our town with a three-way partnership totaling $14 million for a magnificent state-of-the-art recreation center that we are so proud of, Michael. We are so proud to have this to enjoy for all generations to come. Michael served as the president and CEO of Sotheby's. He was a director of Lehman Brothers, the former president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and is a trustee of his beloved Vanderbilt University. And Michael even has me cheering for Vandy baseball, so go Vandy. Speaking of sports, Michael shot 5 strokes below his current age over this past weekend. And, I'm sorry, thank you, 6, winning a golf tournament with his partner. And as Michael carded a round of, what was your score? 70?
7-0.
Yeah, so I'm jealous, but I'm happy for you. And today, Michael is an author. Here with our moderator, Tim Malloy. Michael will share more of his story in his new book, A Nose for Trouble. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Michael Ainslie and Tim Malloy.
Thank you, Mary. Fast, terrific, really wonderful read. There's a lot to cover, so I'm going to ask a few questions, and then hopefully we'll throw it out to audience questions. Let's start at the beginning, flashing back to Tennessee. This is before the boardrooms and the elegant art galleries. Young Michael Ainslie, what were you setting out to do?
Well, first of all, this is a real treat. An awful lot of dear friends and some that go back 40 and 50 and 60 years, which is really special. Thank you all for coming. Tim, I always look at the positive side. I was an extremely lucky young man. I had great parents. Both my mother and father were role models for me. I grew up in a little town in East Tennessee, Kingsport, Tennessee. We had modest resources, not a lot of money, but a lot of nurture, a lot of love, a lot of unconditional love. My father was had to go to work. His father died when he was 16. He was a professor at University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and my dad had to go to work. So he went up to, he started sweeping the floors actually in NCR's office in Knoxville, and he went up to Dayton, Ohio to be trained as a repairman to fix these old cash registers we all recall when we were young. And he was very good at it. He could take these things apart, and he did it in our garage. They were full of thousands of little parts, and he would put them back together. I could never figure out how he did it. But then he got promoted to being a salesman, and he was given, I think, the toughest territory in America. Southwest Virginia, southern Appalachia. The towns were Clinch and Grundy and Gate City, Virginia. These were the most poverty-stricken towns you can imagine. Saturdays, I would go with him. I'd get in the old black Ford station wagon with no air conditioning, and we would go bouncing along these roads of Southwest Virginia. What I learned from my father was how to treat everybody you meet with respect. Whether it was a gas station owner or a 7-Eleven owner or whatever, he was always helpful, respectful, and he sold them cash registers which they did not think they needed or could afford. And then he stayed on. He'd go back after hours and help them close their business. He made them better business people. He taught them how to control their cash, which had a way of leaving the till in those days and probably still does. So I had a great mentor and role model. He was tough too. He very demanding of all of his children. I was a good athlete. I actually was I knew my parents couldn't afford to send me to college and my 3 siblings, so I started delivering papers at 5:30 in the morning and loading milk trucks in the summer and doing all the stuff that most of us did in our youth. But I was a very good basketball player. In my junior year, I was All-State Tennessee. I had one remarkable game. In fact, Mary, thank you for recognizing it. By the way, I didn't think Lou Crampton would believe it, so I actually brought Saturday's scorecard. And I showed it to Lou earlier. He still doesn't believe it. But there have been 2 amazing days in my life in sport. One was Saturday. 7 natural birdies I shot. What was going on? The other was a day in my junior year in high school when I couldn't miss, and I scored 49 points on the basketball court. We won the game 80-40. In any event, Tennessee, Vanderbilt, Kentucky, Davidson, all these schools were coming to see me. And then suddenly something weird, really weird, happened. My senior year in high school, I was supposed to be a great player and doing all these good things. Started losing weight, 20, 30 pounds. I could barely get up and down the basketball court. In fact, I passed out at my high school graduation. I was really very close to dying. My parents put me in an ambulance, sent me down 300 miles to Nashville. And fortunately, one of the world's leading endocrinologists, Grant Little, took one look at me and he said, "This kid has Addison's disease," which is a very poorly understood autoimmune condition where your adrenal glands just quit working. So I was not producing cortisol, which is what we all need to live. Fortunately, cortisone is a perfect replacement for cortisol. And while most of you can't take cortisone without some bad effects, I take a lot of it every day, and it's made my life normal for 60 years since I was diagnosed. Vanderbilt persisted and gave me a half basketball scholarship, thinking I might recover from this, and a half academic scholarship. So I went there. My basketball was not what it had been. So the SEC had to live without me. I gave it up after 1 year and decided to do other things. So that's a little bit of East Tennessee in the early days, and I won't go further, but I will say this. I ended up switching from basketball, got into student government, and fortunately was elected president of the student body when I was a junior at Vanderbilt. That changed my life. That set me on a new trajectory that we'll explore a little further.
All right, let's pick up there. If things had not gone differently in the spring of 1966, you would not be shooting a 70 today or 40, 50 years ago. You're on a fellowship to Southeast Asia. You're a graduate of Vanderbilt. You're 21, economics degree. You find yourself a negotiator in a labor dispute, and then there's that helicopter ride. So tell us that.
Some of you may have known, Alex, you may have known Amo Houghton or know him. He's still alive. He's a wonderful man, chairman of Corning Glass. Amo Houghton is an amazing gentleman, and he saw the need for a traveling fellowship to allow bright young people to see the world and not just go to Oxford and study as a Rhodes or a Guggenheim or whatever, but really to travel and see the world. He created the Corning World Travel Fellowship. I was fortunate to win that at Vanderbilt, and that really opened the world to me. I spent a year traveling. I went to 30 countries, and toward the end of that year, which was the spring of 1966, you may remember the Tet Offensive. The Vietnam War was at its absolute apex. Horrible time in our country, riots, people objecting to the war. I was a conservative from Tennessee, and I really realized I don't understand this war. I'm over here. Why don't I go to Vietnam and try and figure out what's going on? So I did. I show up at Saigon. I go into a bar. There was one circular bar called the Caravel Hotel, a rotating bar on top of a 10-story hotel. Any of you that were there will remember it because that was the watering hole for journalists and all expatriates. And I sit down by a guy who's the personnel director for the company that's building all the military bases for the Americans, called RMK BRJ. All the 4 different construction companies were in that set of initials. And he said, I desperately need an economist. The U.S. Embassy is so stupid, they won't let me give a wage increase, and the cost of living here has tripled in the last 2 years. And I said, well, I'm an economist, which was a little bit of a stretch, but I did have an econ degree from Vanderbilt. I'm 22 maybe. Anyway, so he says, you want a job? I said, how much? He said, $1,600 a month. I said, absolutely. So I went to work. Fast forward, 40,000 Vietnamese workers went on strike, and all, probably because they'd heard I'd been hired, all of the construction for the U.S. military stopped. The ports, the airports, the bases, everything. And the generals were furious. War was trying to, be executed. Anyway, this is why we lost the war and why we were, they picked me and a guy named Peter Ritson from Berkeley, Cal Berkeley, who smoked a lot of pot. I didn't know what pot was until Pete Ritson introduced me to it back then. But we were the negotiating team for the U.S. 40,000 Vietnamese workers who were working for the OICC, the Officer in Charge of Construction. You'll know what that is, Bill. So we go to, the strike happens, we go to a 4-day, 96-hour negotiating session. Didn't sleep for 4 days. I've never before or since tried to do that. I don't recommend it. But we settled the strike. We got overall about a 25% pay increase and a lot of bells and whistles in addition. But so they said, this is so complicated, Ainslie, you take a pilot, an Air America CIA pilot, and a Beechcraft Baron, and you take the north half of South Vietnam, and Ritson, you take the bases to the south. There were 40 construction sites that we had to go visit. So what Tim asked is, I go into Da Nang and Cam Ranh Bay, some of these, I'm sure you all remember these names. And the one that was the most scary and the most dangerous was called Pleiku. Pleiku was a little hilltop, and it was, the Viet Cong had completely surrounded it. So the pilot and I are flying into Pleiku to explain the construction settlement. And he says, the pilot says, Mike, we got to go do a corkscrew landing here. Otherwise, we'll get shot out of the sky. So we're doing this corkscrew landing, and all of a sudden I hear, psst, 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 psst. One of the engines dies. And I thought, this is about where it's going to end. And he says, he looks at me, he says, don't worry. He's sweating a lot. He said, don't worry, we can land on one. He said, just be thankful it wasn't 10 minutes later flight-wise when we were taking off tomorrow morning, because we can't take off on one. So we kind of glided into the Pleiku and survived that moment. And I had to explain to this boss in Pleiku what the heck we had negotiated, because it didn't make much sense. But long story very short, I ended up really thinking we were in the wrong war. It was there were so many things wrong with that war, and we didn't belong there.
We're going to leap around year-wise because there's so much to cover here, and we're going to get to Lehman and Sotheby's in a second. You play a very important role in preserving treasured and important structures and buildings and neighborhoods in our country. Let's talk about the National Trust and that chapter in your life, which is really pretty cool.
Well, my first wife was a preservationist from Savannah, Lucy Scardino. And we lived for 5 years in Cincinnati, and we bought old buildings in Cincinnati and restored them. We did about 15 buildings. Using my real estate knowledge, her preservation knowledge. John Kay knew her well. He's from Savannah, a dear friend from there. And so, surprisingly, not surprisingly, I got asked to go head the National Trust for Historic Preservation in 1980. Jimmy Carter was president, though Reagan was elected the next year. And this job was not a political job, it was a nonprofit. But I go to Washington, and the trust had a tradition of being very focused on house museums, not really what I call community preservation, neighborhood revitalization. So one of my first goals was to figure out how do we make preservation economically viable, because it was more expensive to restore a building than build a new building. So I think Tim's alluding to the fact that I went to see Danny Rostenkowski, who was head of the Ways and Means Committee. And he was from Chicago, and his district was an old district with a lot of old buildings, but not many of them were really historic. And so we actually sent a team out there, a clandestine team. We counted the buildings by age in his district. If you know Rostenkowski, he was very political. And we came back and we said, you've got X thousand buildings that are 30-year-old and X that are 40-year-old, and virtually none are historic. So we got him in Reagan's 1981 tax bill to put in a tax credit, 15% credit, not a deduction, a tax credit if you restore a 30-year-old building, 20% a 40-year-old building, and 25% for a historic building. Well, that passed in the Reagan tax bill, and that changed preservation in America. If any of you know, and I know some of you here have used those tax credits, they make all the difference in the economics of saving versus tearing down. Believe it or not, it still exists. It's now a 20% credit, and there have been 92,000 buildings saved under that tax credit, and the numbers are in the billions of dollars of spending. So that was probably my most significant contribution to the National Trust and to really changing the face of preservation in the country.
Okay, we're going to move to Sotheby's, where amazing time. You structured a lot of things, including who the clientele would be, when museums and galleries should be open. You took a hard look at it. You had this relationship with Al Taubman and Dede Brooks. I know that Taubman was a rough character to deal with, but he gave you pretty much free rein. But this was not easy, but it had to be an amazing several-year chapter.
It was. How many of you knew Al Taubman? Yeah, at least half of you. Al was a fascinating gentleman. He died about 3 years ago. He went out and happened to hire a headhunter named Jack Nordeman to find a CEO of Sotheby's back in the early 80s, when he and a very large group of about 9 or 10 other investors, again, many of you knew many of them, I'm sure, Bill Pitt, Henry Ford, Les Wexner. The best of all of them was Max Fisher, truly amazing man. He was our vice chairman and a remarkable gentleman, and others. It was quite a group of investors that Al put together. Al owned 60% of Sotheby's, and these other investors had smaller pieces of it. He found me through my friend Jack Nordeman. First time he met me, he said, "You're too young. I want a gray-haired European." And I had brown hair, and it was some of it then, and I was from Tennessee, so it didn't match. He offered me the job as head of Sotheby's real estate, which I turned down and went back to the National Trust, even though by this time Lucy and I had gotten divorced, and I actually needed a new job to afford to support two households. So Al became, there went about 4 or 5 months, and he hadn't found his CEO. And I went back to New York at the headhunter's invitation, and Taubman said, "You know what? I think we ought to work together." And we worked out a very good option arrangement for me in terms of stock options, and we went to work. And for the first 5 years, we were a private company. Alfred and I worked extremely well together. Al had a vision. He knew that the art world, that Sotheby's was actually, as Tim said, we were selling to the wrong customers. We were mostly selling to art dealers. And Al knew as a buyer, a collector of art, that Sotheby's was missing its opportunity. Art dealers sell here. Retail collectors pay virtually twice as much for art as an art dealer will. So why not sell to the private collector? And I didn't know that. I didn't come from an art background, but very quickly it became apparent what we needed to do. For example, our galleries weren't open on weekends. That's when private collectors can come. Our catalogs arrive the day before or the day after the sale. Really makes people happy when they get the catalog after the sale. We didn't do traveling exhibitions, going to Tokyo and Palm Beach and LA and so on. We didn't offer financing. Art dealers financed works of art. So many things that were not that complicated that we started doing. What happened? It literally between I came in '84, we were 600 million in sales. By 1989, 5 years later, 3 billion. Went from 600 million to 3 billion. Now, I would predict that 40% of that was getting the retail price. It was the same art, but at a much higher price. And by the way, one of the things my McKinsey, I didn't cover that, but it's a little bit in the book. I walked around and I kept seeing that we were selling what I called junk. Sotheby's was full of stuff that sold for $500 and $300 and $800. So I asked them, what does all this stuff make up of our sales? And they said, well, we did some analysis and half of the lots that we sell for under $1,000. And I said, how much of our revenue does it make up? 4%. So half of our workload was resulting in basically nothing, except a lot of hassle. So guess what? We raised the minimums to $1,000. Now I think Sotheby's minimum is $5,000. So it gave our experts time to go out and cultivate clients like us, you all, and people all over the world. So another important thing we did, we had two different names. New York was called Sotheby Park Burnett. London was called Sotheby's. They had come over and purchased Park Burnett, which was a New York auction house, and the New Yorkers didn't want to give up the name. Well, I was not affected by that, so we got rid of the name. They weren't happy in New York. John Marion was very unhappy. His father, Red Marion, had been the head of Park Burnett. But we became one brand. We unified the company. And so for 5 years, we had a great relationship. Then we went public in '89. Earl Smith, many of you knew Earl. He was another one of our investors. Earl was one of those pushing. He said, I want some liquidity out of this investment. You tell me it's worth a lot more, but I want some cash. And others wanted that as well. So we went public. And that sort of began to change things because the market, the business press took note of the fact that we had really turned this company around. By the way, Al put $40 million into his 60% of Sotheby's only cost him $40 million, if you can believe that. And in my 10 years there, he took out $600 million in stock, dividends, and value of his residual stock. And by the way, Mr. Drahi just bought Sotheby's about 2 months ago, a Frenchman. When Al bought it, just to give you the economics, he and his group paid a total of $130 million, half of which they borrowed from Chase. Drahi just bought it for $3.7 billion. So in 35 years, I'm a numbers guy. I did the math. It's about 10% compounded for 35 years. So it's been a pretty good ride for the art world and the auction world. Anyway, that's a little bit of what's in there. Now, you ask about Dede Brooks and Al Taubman. This is where it gets a little dicey. I promoted Dede Brooks 4 times. She was treasurer of New York when I arrived. And she was the brightest, the most aggressive, the most competent person by far at Sotheby's. Very independent, very willful, did what she wanted to do, didn't like to take direction, but she was very talented. And so I made her executive VP and then president of New York. She was running the biggest operation of Sotheby's. When I got to the end of my 10-year contract with Taubman, I don't know if any of you have ever had a long-term cliff vesting contract, but I had 10 years and nothing vested until 10 years. So that was a real commitment I made, and it worked. We really created value in those 10 years. We got to the end of that, and I had had enough of Dede and Al and other things, and fortunately the company had done well. So I told Al that I was going to leave. He said, "Who can run this place?" And I said, "Well, only one person inside, and that's Dede." I said, "There's a problem. Dede's been so aggressive with so many other division heads in the company, the head of Europe and the head of Asia and the real estate company, that nobody likes working with her." And I said, "Frankly, nobody trusts her." He said, "Wow, would you stay for a year and let's see if she can improve that, if she can change that?" And I did. And it took about 9 or 10 months, and Dede went off to Europe and Asia and did what I'd been doing for the last 10 years, which was running this worldwide business. So we made her worldwide chief operating officer. And she won over those people, those skeptics, those people that she had not worked well with when she was competing against them. Unfortunately, for me and for the company, she began a very long and complex set of collusion with Christie's during that year. It ended up being 500 pages of illegal agreements that were called the hot potato when they got to Christie's lawyers. They agreed on price fixing, non-negotiable commission rates. They agreed on clients. You'll be a Christie's client, you're a Sotheby's client, can't change them. Literally lists of clients were named. They agreed on non-poaching of employees. This was a massive set of agreements. How Dede Brooks thought she could get away with this and how she could justify this, you'll have to ask her. She lives nearby here, and we still see each other, and we're civil, but I don't understand it. Moral compass was vacant. In any event, she blamed Al Taubman for this. She said, "Al made me do this to keep my job." They had a trial. Al went to jail. He was convicted of price fixing. In my opinion, Al was the fall guy. I had many, many interactions with Al where we disagreed. Never once did he do anything against the interest of Sotheby's, nor ever overrule something I felt strongly about. We held an auction in Russia. He was East German and a Jew from East Germany. He did not want to see us do an auction in Russia. We after Dede financed Allen Bond with 27 million of debt on the irises, our clients got furious. Leonard Lauder and a bunch of other people called me up and said, "You're inflating the price of art by providing debt financing to buyers." So I said, "We're stopping it." I agreed with them. We probably were at that point. It was not illegal, but it didn't help our serious collectors. And so we stopped it. Al and Dede were furious. They did not agree with me. We stopped financing buyers. We stopped selling ivory. We were being used as a fence by the ivory poachers. They learned how to chemically treat ivory and make it look like it was old. So we stopped selling ivory unless you had a certificate that showed it was 100 years old. So we did a lot of things that Al disagreed with, but he never once overruled me. And yet I saw Dede do things such as finance Bond without ever getting anybody's approval. We had a $5 million limit on financing without approval from our executive committee, which was Al, Max Fisher, and me. She didn't obtain it. She just gave Bond the financing. Later on, in a much more egregious case, she actually made a $115 million loan to a client without approval. That came out in Taubman's trial as to how independent and really operating on her own she was. So I believe Al Taubman got a raw deal. I don't know whether he knew about the price fixing, but I guarantee you, in my opinion, he didn't direct it. So there's a lot more detail in the book about that, but it's not fun stuff.
Now we get to Lehman. The agonizing death throes of Lehman Brothers. Paint us a picture. It's September 2008. You're with fellow CEOs. You're trying to save a renowned 158-year-old company. You're one of 10 people in a boardroom. Is that right?
Yes.
What the heck was that like? And paint us a picture of the mood and the prelude to all of it.
It was the worst week of my life.
Could you talk about mention the 10 people? There's a few of them.
Yes. Henry Kaufman, John Akers, former head of IBM, Tom Cruikshank, the former CEO of Halliburton, wonderful guy, Roland Hernandez, former head of several companies, Admiral Marcia Evans, a retired naval admiral, Roger Berlin, Bob Niederlander knows well. It was a pretty good group, and one testimonial to that was that after the bankruptcy, the Judge Peck, asked us to stay on as the board for the next 5 years. And I actually chaired the board after the bankruptcy. So Lehman was succeeding in the latter stages before the bankruptcy. We were voted the top investment bank in the business in 2006. We were taking top people away from Goldman Sachs. John Walker moved over to become head of Neuberger Berman and all of our asset management. Lehman was really doing very well. Unfortunately, the subprime and the housing crisis of that time, which took down Bear Stearns and took down a lot of others, was not actually a business Lehman was big in at all. But the whole, what happened that week is, on Tuesday, Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke had meetings with Jamie Dimon of Chase. Chase was our clearing bank. They were our bank that funded us for business every day, every night. At the end of those meetings with Paulson and Bernanke on Tuesday, the head of investment banking for Chase called Dick Fuld, our chairman, and said, "We need $5 billion more collateral for you to reopen tomorrow." The next day he called again and said, "We want $3.5 billion more." Chase took $8.5 billion of our cash in the last 3 days of our existence. Turned out we sued them, and that suit went on for 4 or 5 years, and they won because in the fine print of our loan agreement, they had the right to demand additional collateral. Nonetheless, it was our liquidity. Lehman did not have an asset shortage, it had a cash shortage. And that's what ended up, basically, we didn't have the cash to keep going. What happened, I think Paulson made a political decision. He made a decision, I've got to save AIG because if I don't save AIG, it will probably take Goldman Sachs under. He had just sold $460 million of Goldman stock about 18 months earlier when he stopped being CEO and moved over to be Secretary of the Treasury. So was he conflicted? Not technically, but he certainly had a lot of loyalty to Goldman Sachs. And I'm sure he will not like my book because Bernanke and Paulson came up with an argument. You've probably heard this if you're in the business. We didn't have the tools to save Lehman Brothers. That is not true. All they needed to do was continue lending under what's called the Primary Dealer Credit Facility, PDCF, or let Lehman become a bank holding company, which lets you borrow against less liquid assets. They required all the others to become bank holding companies the week after we went under. We had been requesting it and they'd been denying it. And then they decided to force the others to, so they could not have any further liquidity issues. It's still unfortunate. Do you know why the German bond is selling today? The 10-year German bond is minus 0.6%. And that's because of Lehman's bankruptcy. The world has still not recovered. There's a study, unfortunately, I didn't bring a book that I wish I had called Lehman and the Fed. It's a bright red and white covered book written by Lawrence Ball, the head of economics at Johns Hopkins. He spent 10 years after the Lehman bankruptcy reconstructing what happened. In his book, for those of you that are serious finance geeks like some of us, you should read Lawrence Ball's book, The Fed and Lehman Brothers, because he makes it extremely clear there was plenty of assets. The issue was liquidity. It's as though we have 3 mortgages. Lehman was too leveraged. There's no question we were too leveraged, but so were the other banks. We all were too leveraged. But the assets would have performed fine had the liquidity crisis been averted.
This is a good launch point for anyone in the audience to ask questions. I have to get to the Posse Foundation eventually, and I've got 10 other questions, but I'm not going to get to them. So does anybody have a question for Michael?
Yes.
Mike, do you think that Paulson held a grudge against Ball for not handying up for long-term capital credits demise in Connecticut? And this was retribution by Goldman and Diamond and others in the business who did put up the money that the Treasury wanted private investment bankers to fund that cash crunch by long-term capital credit?
It's a great question. I don't know what the nature of exactly their friendship or lack thereof was, but that was a factor. Long-term capital management it went out of business, and Paulson led the effort to build the book to basically save it. He asked Lehman for $250 million. For a long time, Fuld wouldn't put up anything. He finally did agree to put up $100 million. Believe it or not, these numbers are crazy. But so he basically turned Paulson down. You're right, and I think that went into the equation. Yes.
Thank you.
Anybody else? When you read about the Posse Foundation, which I've known about for a long time, that's the legacy moment, is it not? People know what this is, but tell us how it started and what it means to you and what it's accomplished.
It is by far the most important and fun and satisfying thing I've been involved with. 30 years ago, a young woman in New York named Debbie Beale, graduate of Brandeis, was in her 20s, 23 or 4 years old, and she had a group of college dropouts, kids from New York that had dropped out of college, sitting around in a focus group. And she said, "Why are you home? Why are you not back in college?" One kid said, "If only I'd had my posse with me, I would have been fine. I wouldn't have dropped out." And this was when a lot of New York leaders were mentoring young people and saying, "I'll help you through college and I'll be your mentor." Well, the kid got to college and the mentor really couldn't help very much because it was so different. Debbie called up a professor she had met somewhere down the road earlier at Vanderbilt, fortunately my alma mater, and she said, "Would you guys take a gamble on 6 or 8 kids from New York City that we'll pick for their leadership skills? And they won't measure up on the SATs, they don't have the money to take prep courses, they don't go to great high schools, but we will find you great leaders." Well, Vanderbilt fortunately said yes. That was the beginning of the Posse program and the Posse Scholars program. those 6 kids were predicted to all fail at Vanderbilt. They pink sheeted them, they call it, and they said these kids won't be able to do the work. Well, not only did they all graduate, Shirley Collado, whose father was a cab driver from the Dominican Republic, mother worked in a factory in New York. Shirley Collado went on to get a PhD at Duke in clinical psychology, became the dean of the college at Middlebury, the provost at Rutgers, and today she's president of Ithaca College. 45 years old. And I can tell you 20 or 30 stories like that. The early Posse scholars are now in their early to mid 40s, and they are just knocking it out of the park. Partners in law firms, professors at universities. Monique Nelson is the CEO and principal owner of the Uniworld Group, the largest multicultural ad agency in the world. We pick leaders, you develop leadership, and they go out and soar.
They coach each other.
That's the whole point. They coach each other. The Posse is a traveling support team. So now Posse has just exploded. We're now at 57 universities. We pick 10 kids that go to each of those 57 universities, and they're the very best. Cornell, Davidson, Cal Berkeley, Pomona, Vanderbilt, on and on, Brandeis. We don't do the Ivies because they say they don't give merit scholarships. These kids are given a merit leadership scholarship. This is not a need-based program. It's a leadership program, and that's a subtle differentiation which really matters to a kid when they arrive on campus. If they're just a poor minority kid, that puts them in one category. If they're there as a leadership scholar under a Posse scholarship, they are expected to become a leader. And by the way, 75% of them become president of something on campus. 91% of them graduate. We've now sent 9,200 kids to college on this program, and it is just continuing to be amazing. One other quick word. 5 years ago, the president of Vassar called up and said, would you consider applying your model to veterans? And we said, that's a really good idea. So we now have Veterans Posse Scholar programs at Vassar, Dartmouth, Wesleyan, University of Chicago just started taking a Veterans Posse. They're their second one this year, and the University of Virginia. So we're now doing veterans. We also have a STEM Posse program. You know, when you put together a group of really talented people, they help each other and they succeed together. And that's what's happening. It's a very simple concept. And Debbie Beal, still the CEO. She's won a MacArthur Genius Award. She got a big piece of Obama's Nobel Prize money. He gave it out to several nonprofits. Posse was one of those.
We're going to wrap up, but I have to go back to golf because this is my thing. Augusta. Go.
Well, my first boss was a man named Ron Daniel. Many of you may know Ron. He was the managing partner of McKinsey. He hired me out of Harvard Business School, and he is a member of Augusta. And so I went there 2 or 3 times to play with him. One of the stories I tell, I had to in the book. I would have told the latest one, but the book's already out. But we played for 2 days. First day, I birdied number 12, which is the par 5 over the creek. Hit a wedge in and made a putt for the birdie. The second day, I birdied all the other 3 par 5s. So in 2 days, I birdied all 4 of the par 5s, and it is now known as the Ainslie Grand Slam of golf.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, so much. You are such an amazing convener. And as an executive committee member of the Civic Association and a great leader to this town, we have a gift for you. Thank you so much. And Michael is kind enough, he has books for everyone, so there will be a book signing, and also maybe a swing tip on the golf game, too, so. And to Doug Bingham, we thank you so much for your sponsorship of this program, and we look forward to bringing our members and directors your way. And please take the time to get to know Doug and his colleagues today, too. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Global Series event.